Hi guys, this is Anya. I'm making this video finally because it's a video I've considered creating for so many years. It's a subject that I find really interesting. Now, I'm not really good at keeping up with popular subjects in the community these days. I watch very few tarot tubers, to be honest with you. But it is a subject I used to at least find that it wasn't discussed enough. Even though people would do depth years, it would often be with the intention to connect in depth with one or a few decks and so on, but it wouldn't be what I'm going to talk about, which is how to stop buying tarot and oracle decks when you don't want anymore. So I can start by saying that I was definitely in this I don't really know what to call it, but like new deck addiction era a couple of years ago. I don't know if it was maybe around 2015 to 2018 or something like that. Um, I can't remember exactly when I started to slow down on getting new decks. Um, but it's been a couple of years, and I can just honestly say that these days I do not buy a lot of decks. I'm pretty sure that this year I have sold more decks than I have purchased, and I think that was the case last year as well. I really only get, I don't know, maybe 4 new decks a year, and I also get rid of a couple of decks every year. So I wanted to talk about how I got here because I know that many people out there in the community, they find themselves almost, I don't want to overuse the word addicted because addiction is a serious problem. uh, but to be a little bit lazy, I might as well call it an addiction. I know that people are addicted to new decks, and it's probably something that is on the shadow side of this whole tarot tube thing, or I mean, actually, a lot of social media, because we constantly see new decks. We get tempted with new decks. If there was no social media, like if I go back to like 2005, when I was really into only tarot, not oracles, I would see discussions and a couple of photos about new decks on Eclectic Tarot Forum, but it would only be like a little bit. It didn't hit me right in the face. Because today I find, when you go on Instagram or YouTube, instantly, if the algorithm knows that you love tarot and oracle decks, you instantly get hit with unboxings, you know, lists of new decks being released, reviews, and all of that stuff. And I'm just gonna say, none of that is wrong, in my opinion. If you do deck reviews, unboxings, and so on, you're not doing anything wrong. Um, but what I'm saying is that it can feel like a temptation. And honestly, this also comes down to, in regard to many other hobbies, interests, whatever you want to call it. I know it's the same in the makeup community because I also happen to love makeup. And as soon as I open Instagram or YouTube, I see a bunch of photos or videos of new eyeshadow palettes, lipsticks, and whatever it may be. So this isn't a problem that only the tarot community has. It's everywhere. We just live in that sort of society where we are constantly tempted to consume more and more and more. Um, so, yeah, I was definitely in the new deck addiction trenches a couple of years ago. And I'm gonna say that the first step towards stop buying new decks, if you feel like it's a problem, is to, and this is a classic, but it is to admit that you have a problem. um, and that you are looking for how to change this behavior or pattern of yours. For me, it was never a real shopaholic problem. I never, uh, needed to loan money from someone to get a new deck, or I was never in financial trouble, or even, I could always fit my decks in my home. So it wasn't like an actual tangible problem for me to get new decks, but I just found myself a little bit tired of my own behavior, because often I would feel like I get excited because a new deck was released and I was really into it, like looking at images, looking at videos online of this deck and being like, oh, when it gets here, I'm going to use it so much. I'm going to use it for shadow work. I'm going to use it for this or that. And then when I got the deck, when it arrived, I would quite often be like, yeah, it's pretty nice. Oh well. And I would put it to the side, not really using it or really appreciating it, connecting with it. It would just be another new thing, and I would start looking forward to getting even another new deck. So that is why I found it problematic, because I didn't want to feel that way. I wanted to go back to when I was in my late teens and I got a new deck, and I would be so grateful. I mean, like most teenagers, I didn't have any money. So when I finally had a little bit of money to buy a new deck, I would be so excited and I would use it so much, and it would, not all the time, but most of the time, it would become my new favorite deck, and I would just like obsess about it and be so into it for a couple of months before I got a new deck, and I would appreciate that new deck maybe like even more. Sip of tea. And I wanted to go back to that feeling, to getting a new deck and actually being really excited and grateful that I could get that deck and get to know it and really dig into this new deck. And honestly, like whatever deck you get, even the ones that I find kind of bland, if you want to dig deep into a deck and connect with a deck really deeply, you can do that no matter what deck it is. But if you just put it to the side and you get a new deck a couple of days later, it's not going to really give you anything. You lose that feeling of depth. It's just a new thing, as if you bought a new cup or a candle or whatever it may be. It's just a new thing to have in your home. So that is what I wanted. When I was getting a new deck every week, it wasn't maybe every week, but I got a lot of new decks around, yeah, like I said, 2016, 17, or whatever. I just stopped appreciating them. I didn't like that. So my first step was to admit that I don't like this behavior. It's not right, and I want to change it. And the second step was to go on a depth year or a no buy year. I know that depth year wasn't necessarily always something that worked for me, because I tend to be very, well, I don't really know how to explain it, but mm, I go very much back and forth, and I need something new. Um, and I don't mean like brand new, but I just sometimes I need something spicy and sometimes I need something sweet. Do you know what I mean? Like I can't really foretell what I'm going to be enjoying for a whole year that I'm looking at in January. To me, that's really, really difficult. I just find myself very, I need a certain flexibility. I, in a way, I'm not very disciplined, to be completely fair with you. Um, so a depth year, I think that if you want my advice, you can explore that, explore the depth years. There are tons of videos out on YouTube where people talk about it. But for me, the big thing was actually to have a no buy year. I decided to not buy any new decks, no matter what. And I think, if I remember correctly, I did have maybe one or two exceptions to that rule. So I allowed myself to, for the year that is coming up, I allow myself to buy one or two new decks if I get rid of one or two new decks. So they had to be really, really special. If I remember correctly, I did. What is it? Oh, yeah. I did pre order the Bonestone and Earthflesh Tarot deck when I was having a no buy year. I think that was it 2018? Could have been. Because that is a deck that I felt it was so special, and I love that deck. I'm super happy to own it. So that was one of my exceptions. I also allowed myself, I think it was a couple of years or a year or two later, I allowed myself to get a new Alana Fairchild deck that I knew was coming out. Um, because I really enjoy her decks. So I knew that I allowed myself to have a little bit of freedom, even though the main rule was to not buy new decks. And I was pretty firm on that. I just decided to not break that rule. And like I said, to have a little bit of softness, because if you are, like me, a total lover of tarot and oracles, you know that there's always going to be maybe a deck every year that is just like, oh my god, I must have it. So don't be too hard on yourself, but also don't be too soft on yourself, because if you start to make exceptions constantly, you're not going to get anywhere. So, step number 3, I would advise you to work really in depth with the decks that you already own. If you're like me and you actually have like a collection, you have more than 20 decks, there is probably one or two decks that you've never really explored. And that is something that I did during these like no new deck years. I would look through my collection and realize that, oh, I've basically never used this deck. And it comes with a guidebook, so perhaps I should do that. So there are quite a few decks that I would say almost rediscovered in my collection. And I discovered that, wow, I actually really love this deck. Why did I not use it for 4 years? Well, because I was constantly tempted to buy new decks instead of really looking at what I already had. And there are also a lot of challenges and well, you know what I mean with challenges, on YouTube and on Instagram. where you can, if you decide to use one of your decks that you already own for a whole month, you can follow along with a challenge. And it doesn't matter if it's a couple of years old, it really doesn't. You can also see if you have already, if you're like me, a little bit of a book hoarder, or perhaps allow yourself to buy a workbook, a tarot workbook that you can use with many different decks even. So that, these are just ideas to actually dig into what you already own and not always feel like you have to get something new, because you don't. The decks you already own, again, if you have a couple of decks, they have so much depth and there is so much to explore and discover in your decks. So I would also advise you to discover for yourself what you want in a tarot or oracle collection, because I also, it got a lot easier for me to stop buying decks when I discovered that my collection was more or less complete. I didn't need any new decks, and I asked myself, what do I want with my collection? How many decks do I want to own? When do they start to feel overwhelming for me? Because sure, I do read cards every now and then for someone else, for friends, not very often, unfortunately, or for clients. I haven't for a while, but I do every now and then use my cards for others. But most of the time, I just use them for myself. So for me, there is no point in having a huge collection. And also, let me quickly say, I don't judge if you have 5,000 decks and you're happy with that. I applaud you. It's, that's great. But for me, I discovered that around, you're gonna think this is so much, but whatever. Around 100 decks is my limit. And that is about 50-50 for me. No, it's more like, no, I think it is 50-50. I have 50 tarot decks and 50 oracle decks, more or less. That is what I feel works for me. I would, in a perfect world, I would have maybe 80 or 70 decks. But I really have a problem with letting go of decks. Also, a really interesting realization about myself is that it's better to not buy a deck, because after a couple of weeks I will forget about it and I won't miss it in any way. But I have at times sold decks and had really big regrets about it. I tend to get attached in true Cancer fashion. So I also know that about myself now, that I get too attached to decks, so it's better to not get new ones instead of trying to let go of decks that I really have a hard time letting go of. But really, I think looking at your collection and finding out what do you want with your collection, that is really important. Personally, I want a varied collection that fits me as a person. Many people out there say that if you are a true tarot lover, you need to have one original or standard Rider-Waite-Smith, one Tarot de Marseille, and one Thought deck. I don't subscribe to that. I'm not interested in Thought. I'm not interested in Tarot de Marseille. I've read with both of those decks. I used to own them. I used them a lot because I wanted to learn about them. They are so pivotal to the tarot world. tarot world. So but after a couple of years, I just discovered they aren't my cup of tea. So I let them go, and I have no regrets about that. So I don't follow that rule. For me, it's about owning decks that I really love, in different ways. Um, I don't want to have, well, like only feminine and pretty decks, or only vampire decks, or only cat decks, whatever it may be. For me, it's important that I have a varied collection, that I can bring out a really dark, bloody shadow deck. And maybe the next day I want something flowery, pretty, soft, and light. That's the kind of collection that I want to have. And one thing that really helps me to not buy new decks is to actually compare a new deck to my collection. Let's see if I have an example. Well, if there is a new deck that I see on Facebook, so I see a couple of photos and I'm like, oh, this one might really be something that I'm gonna enjoy. Then I will try to find a video that shows every card. And I really look at it and I ask myself, is this a deck that would stick out in my collection? Or is it a deck that already looks and feels a lot like a deck that I already own and use? Because I don't want to have, well, quote unquote, the same deck in my collection repeated over and over again. It is the reason why I let go of the Lily White Tarot. Quite recently, I sold it because I found it to be a little bit too similar in look and feel to my favorite Lumina Tarot. So I looked through it a couple of times and I just felt like when I own both of these decks, I'm just going to go for the Lumina 95% of the time. So the Lily White is a little bit too similar to Lumina, and it's not going to make me use the Lily White. So I did let go of that one. And that is how I view new decks these days. I look at the artwork and the feel and the theme of it, and kind of decide for myself, is this deck too similar to a deck that I already own? Because I don't need repetition in my collection. And of course, I have my personal taste. So of course some decks are going to be a little bit similar, but I'm looking for decks that aren't too similar, in my opinion. So that is also a little bit of a tip from me to you, to never make quick decisions when you want a new deck. Always consider, why do I want this deck? Does it somehow fill an important space in my collection, or is it just another Rider-Waite-Smith clone that doesn't really add anything new? That is something that helps me. But like I said, I want to have a bit of a varied collection and not the same deck over and over again. And like the last thing that I have to say is that this is really hard in the beginning. I felt so tempted by so many decks coming up. When I started this project to not obsessively buy new decks. But after a while, it really becomes second nature. These days, like I would say 90% of the decks that I click on Instagram or YouTube or whatever, new decks that I start to look at, In just a couple of minutes, I'm like, no, not for me. So for me, it has just become second nature. And if it is a deck that I start to feel, yeah, maybe I could like this, I always wait a couple of days, even a couple of weeks, and not just buy it, you know, 5 minutes after seeing an unboxing. I never do that these days. I always consider what this deck adds to my collection, my spiritual practice, and my life before clicking the buy button. So I hope that these little tips were useful for you. Um, it is a subject I would like to see discussed a little bit more in the community because it is so easy to fall into the temptation trap of constantly wanting something new and shiny. And also, I think it's extra hard when you are very new to the tarot and oracle card world. Um, and it's also, just my honest opinion, it's also quite damaging. If you find tarot today and you're like, yes, this is exactly what I've been looking for, and feel really called to it and fascinated and interested, if you get a new deck and then a week later you get another new deck, and 2 weeks later you get three new decks, in my opinion, that is not going to be the best way to learn and connect with tarot at its foundation. I think that there is a huge risk that you are just falling into a confusing deep hole when you keep switching between a bunch of different decks, and you never allow yourself to just kind of sit still with one or two decks and really work through them and really find a way to connect with tarot in depth. I think it's really important, again, just my opinion. If I say the Seven of Swords, I think it's really important that as a tarot reader, if you want to take this more seriously, then instantly when I say Seven of Swords, you have an image in your mind. And it doesn't matter what deck it comes from. I'm more liberal around that these days. If the Wild Unknown is your first deck, then you're going to have that Seven of Swords. For me, I'm going to say it's always the original Rider-Waite-Smith that pops up. That's the Seven of Swords that I see. But I think it's really important if you want to know tarot in depth. I think that it is important that you have every card in your mind and in your heart. I just personally think that is really, really important. And if you are a beginner and you're constantly changing decks, I think it's going to be really hard to get to that point. So I think that you're just making the journey a little bit too hard for yourself. So that is why I want to bring this subject up, because especially for beginners, it can lead to a very quick tarot burnout, where you just feel like you're never learning tarot for real, and you're just jumping from deck to deck without understanding why you're so confused. There is such a thing as too much of a good thing, I think. So that's all I had to say. Sorry, a little bit of a long video, but I'm really interested in this subject, and I don't see it talked about that much. So have a great day, everyone. Bye bye.